for joining us for Virtual First Friday. Today we have our virtual artist in residence, David R. Boxley. He is a Tsimshian artist and he does a lot of work in formline as well as carving. And it is my pleasure to introduce him to you all. Take it away, David.
Dag dem alige dag wasem shagian gibam lacha di wayu lach gibu di ero so mach lachasla di wil watku skogi jau wadi na gwadu lach ski di echt gamas wa nadi agwiniayu Liz Francis wadi noyu a yeld genu dem wilde acht with dem Gwyneth and Dak Washam goal double than a Hachelshu at a mechtu a down the dual shoe Dak Washam. Hi everybody, I'm really happy to be able to talk to you tonight about my artistic journey, my job. And my name is David Robert Boxley. My Somalia name is Kibam Lacha. I'm from the Wolf clan from Metlakatla, Alaska. My father is David Albert Boxley. My mother is Elizabeth Francis from Seattle. And I'm just going to jump right in. I was supposed to give a lecture there at SHI right last month when all this was, this pandemic was starting. So I thought I'd take tonight to talk a little bit about some of the things I was going to talk about that night. And hopefully you all won't be terribly bored. An artist's career, in my experience, starts pretty early, and the person's upbringing influences what they do, their mindset as they create. And I just thought I'd share a little bit about my own history. My father is from Metlakatla, and my mother is from Seattle. They met when my dad was teaching school in Seattle. They got married in 1980 here in Metlakatla, and I was born about a year later. The very first potlatch ever hosted in modern times was hosted by my parents in 1982. I was just over a year old. So I've kind of had a front seat to this cultural resurgence my whole life. There had been carving here in Metlakatla since the 70s with Miss Jack Hudson and a children's dance group that was started then also. My dad grew up being an artist, just doing sketches in school and things like that, and he minored in art at college. So I suppose there's some of that was just naturally passed down. My grandfather, my mother's father, was also terribly creative, and so my parents have told me that at 2 or 3 years old they could leave me, I'm sure not totally unsupervised, but could leave me alone for quite a long period of time with a stack of paper and crayons. And when I was 4 years old, I brought a drawing to my dad of a man. If the way you're looking at your screen, here's a man sitting in jail with the bars in front of him. He's holding onto the bars. And my dad said, "Oh, that's neat, son." I said, "No, turn it over." And on the back side, I had drawn it from the other view, from as if you were behind him in the cell. And Dad said that was when he knew I was going to be an artist. But back then, I mean, I would have guessed all the way up through college that I was going to be a comic book artist, because I've been a Superman fan since I was 2 years old. I think there was a Superman S on my second birthday cake. I started carving when I was 6. And I've often thought that I don't know what Dad was thinking, giving a 6-year-old a carving knife, but I do remember we tried to be as safe as possible. He put a board over my lap so that I wouldn't stab my legs with the carving knife. And I have a very clear memory of trying to learn how to adze around that age and just hacking a piece of wood to bits. Around that same time, my dad had been a school teacher, and he became a carver. And in 1986, he decided to retire from teaching completely. We moved to Seattle, and he started showing his work in galleries and things like that. And his name really got out there, and I was very lucky to be able to go with him on a lot of the trips he'd take. Like he'd get a totem pole commission, say in Connecticut. I think that was one of our first trips, and I'd get to go with him and help put up the totem pole. And we would dance, and it would just be him and I in a cassette recorder or cassette player, boombox. And that would play the songs that we would dance to. We didn't have our own dance groups yet. And it never felt like it was, like I was being forced to go do this thing. It was just, I got to be with Dad, and I was in his shop all the time growing up, from diapers, all the way up till I started actually working. And then around 13 years old, I started selling my work in galleries. Actually sold my first mask when I was 7. I'm sure my dad carved the majority of it, but I worked on it. I sold it for $75. So that would be 1988, my first sale. And I remember cashing the check in ones so that I could play with all the $1 bills. I started selling my work in galleries at 13, and even had my first had pieces in my first gallery shows throughout my teenage years. But like I said, all of that was kind of fun on the side, just stuff to do. My passion was comic books, cartooning, that kind of thing. And when I was 15, through a friend of our family, we met a man named Chris Hopkins, who I highly recommend, if you can find him, to follow on Instagram or Facebook. Chris Hopkins, he's an illustrator. And Dad, my father's a pretty bold personality, and he just asked Chris if I could apprentice with him. Will you teach my son, basically? And he agreed, and for 3 years while I was in high school, nearly every weekend I'd get to go learn how to draw, paint, do portraits, life drawing. I got an amazing education from Chris Hopkins. And he got me ready for college, and I got a scholarship to go to an art school in Seattle. After a couple of years of that, recognizing that the illustration angle that I wanted to go toward in my career, that profession, in the way I wanted to do it, with hand-done oil paintings, kind of a Norman Rockwell style career, didn't exist anymore. And everything was digital. And at the time, I wasn't prepared to switch over to that. And to be totally honest, when I tried to incorporate my culture into projects at school, I actually got graded down for what they how did they put it? Repeating a theme, a motif. And I got pretty sick of all that. And I thought, well, I know how to be a carver, and I'm very passionate about it. Passionate about my culture, and I love making art. And I thought, well, that's an angle to go. So I left school and became a carver full time. I worked throughout my 20s. One of the biggest things that happened in that time, as far as the stepping stones in my artistic journey, was a book came out titled The Transforming Image, Painted Arts of the First Nations of the Northwest Coast, something like that. And because I had learned from my father how to put formline together, then I had access to all these photographs in this book. It's an amazing book. And I studied these old pieces for years. I did replicas. I filled sketchbooks upon sketchbooks and really made an effort to understand the classical way of creating formline. And eventually I had all these aha moments that would move me closer and closer to being able to practice that classical style. And formline has become a real passion of my life. And then when I was 28, I'd been spending some time in Vancouver, and a friend of mine encouraged me to do something that I'd been thinking about for years, which was to ask Robert Davidson if I could apprentice with him. And we met at that's one of my favorite stories. We met at a dim sum restaurant in Vancouver. And immediately Robert had a couple questions for me. He asked, what's your dad gonna say? And out of respect for my father. And I said immediately, what I knew to be the truth is that my dad would be proud of me. And then he asked, how do you feel about doing Haida art? And I said, I don't care. You have tricks that I want to learn. So I started working with him in March of 2009. And for 2 years, I worked at his studio. He ended up not having me apprentice. I just got to work on his pieces, and I learned a lot. And then right after, my grandmother had passed away during the time I had worked for Robert. And upon ending my time there at his studio, I moved home and carved my grandmother's memorial pole. And what was special about that one for me is still one of the most important art projects I ever got to work on personally, was that at that first potlatch I spoke of earlier on my dad, that my mom and dad hosted, Dad carved a pole for his grandmother's memorial and raised it. He was 30 years old, and I was 30 years old when I got to do that for my grandmother. And that really meant a lot to me. One of the things about Northwest Coast art in particular is that the Western idea of art, which is, beautiful things hanging on a wall for decoration, and that's the main purpose often, doesn't really apply to what we do. And we have a responsibility, Northwest Coast carvers in particular, I can speak as a carver, that our responsibility is to create the crests and images that represent families and their histories. And the argument is sometimes made about, how can you sell your work? But if you do enough study, one of the things you'll find is that artists work very often, there's lots of evidence of this, commissioned by not only other, like in my case, other Tsimshian villages, but like Tlingit villages and particular chiefs would commission artwork from another artist from another tribe. And that's why you see Tsimshian made stuff, all the way up in like Klukwan. So even though that the market has changed from that trade economy, and you'd trade pieces you'd be taken care of as an artist in the old days, and that's transformed to a cash economy. That economy, the way it works, the way the art market works, it allows me the time and freedom to help host potlatches or do what I'm doing now, which is trying to become fluent in my language and to help the movement of saving our languages. So I moved home in 2015 to do that, and haven't been actually creating quite as much art as I'm used to because of that. But that's a snapshot at my artistic journey. I do want to reiterate, though, how important how the art I make is tied into who I am and the culture that I come from. The identity that comes along with being a Tsimshian is something to be very proud of, but it's also a responsibility. And to give you a glimpse of how that started for me, I wanted to read something tonight, and I hope my father is okay with this. In 1985, he wrote, there's a book here called The Devil and Mr. Duncan. It's a book about Metlakatla's history, and he wrote something in the front of it for my brother and I. We were little kids. I was 4 and my brother was 2. But this is the kind of upbringing I had, and often when I wonder, how did I end up doing what I do and being who I am, this is a good snapshot of why. October 15th, 1985. David and Zachary, you have a very proud heritage to cherish. As you read this book, I hope you understand. Our people have had to go through so many trials to get where we are now. It is true, our Indian culture was sacrificed, but I hope that I, in my time, can instill in you the extreme pride I have in the Tsimshian blood I have, that you have, and I hope I can also build in you the foundation that will help you to succeed in the white man's world. We can never go back to the old ways, and it will never do to rehash animosities and mistakes our forefathers made. But we are charged, if we have the spirit, to never let the reasons behind Metlakatla's existence fade away. Be proud of who you are and work to be the very best you can be. I love you, your dad. I wanted to do that tonight because I'm very lucky to be David Boxley. I'm very lucky to be his son, and on my mom's side, I come from a very caring, loving family, and I'm terribly grateful that I get to have opportunities like this to talk to folks and take your questions, and I'm very fortunate to have the career that I have. So, having said all that, I hope I'm actually still online talking to anybody, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was just beautiful. Wow, those words your father had, they're beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a few questions that have rolled in.
Okay.
The first one that came in is from Kathy Dye, and she's wondering, do you have a memory of when was the first time you saw a piece of Northwest Coast art and that moment was life-altering?
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember the first time I ever saw Northwest Coast art because I've been around it since I was a baby. But the first time that it really made an impact on me, I must have been, again, 7 years old or so. And one of the trips I got to take with my dad, we went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And at the time, it's been in the news actually recently because they're remodeling the Northwest Coast Hall there at that museum. There's this really big canoe. I believe it's like 60 feet long. And for years now, it's been hanging from the ceiling. But when I was a little boy, it was on the ground in this big room. And inside of it were all of these figures, mannequins, dressed in different types of regalia, warriors regalia, chiefs regalia, and filled with bentwood boxes. And it looked like this either trading mission or a raiding mission or something, where this canoe was set up as if it, how it would have been back in the old days. And I was just blown away by the size of this thing, but the beauty of it and the complexity of not only the canoe itself, but what everyone was wearing and all of the stuff inside of it. And it's moments like that that have stuck with me, and I've often tried to get across when I teach that we weren't simple people. We weren't primitive people. We were a really complex civilization. And, you don't find, you don't have how do we put it this way? You don't make art at the level and in the amount that we made on the Northwest Coast if you're worried about what you're going to eat every day. We were an advanced civilization that, and now you can find hundreds and hundreds of collections of thousands of pieces in hundreds of museums all over the world. And that was the first time that really, I guess that the things Dad had been telling me were true, that to look at this amazing culture we come from. That was the first time.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I love how you brought up the fact that if we were worried about, surviving, we wouldn't have the time to be creative.
Yeah.
I feel like, I went to the store the other day and all the art supplies is gone because everyone has this extra time on their hands. And it is really neat to be able to express yourself and your culture throughout your artwork, which leads me into my next question from Lindsay Brolini. And she's wondering, have you ever thought about illustrating a comic book? And yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, finish.
Well, then I was wondering on top of that, I thought it would be so cool if you came up with your own children's show and your own design. Have you ever thought about that as well?
Not so much a show, but I've had several ideas for comic books over the years. I have somewhere a pile of old mock-ups of the two main ones that have stuck with me that I still think about doing very often. Matter of fact, I would really like to, especially now working in a language that I could do a bilingual comic, is illustrating the Raven stories, since those are fairly universal on the Northwest Coast, and taking kind of a serious approach to them, but in graphic novel form. And the other, which I started as I was about 13, was to anthropomorphize our clan. Tsimshian people we don't have moieties. We don't have just the two raven and eagle. We have raven, eagle, wolf, and killer whale. So I was going to turn those four main crests, into superheroes, these half human, half animal superheroes. And both ideas are still kicking around in my head. So we'll see. There's just not enough time in the day most of the time.
I have to say, when you said that superhero idea, if you could have seen my camera, my jaw dropped. That would be amazing. That would be so cool. I love that idea. I hope you're able to do that. I know you're really focused on, preserving the language right now, but you could tie that in the book,
Sure.
be all in Sealaska. How awesome. We have another question from Allison Brumner, and she's wondering, what's your favorite piece you've made for a Northwest Coast gallery?
For a gallery. Gee, that's a really good question. There was a panel that my father and brother and I worked on that went to Quintana Galleries in Portland. It was kind of biographical. It was about our lives. It showed through crests, my father, my brother and I, and my great grandfather who raised my dad. And that actually sold and was donated to the Portland Art Museum. So I believe it's on display at the Portland Art Museum. That's a big one. That's probably the most important one personally. I've had a lot of fun working with galleries over the years. One of the things that is tough, especially as you get more and more mature in your art form, is that galleries are often they're often about your bottom line, their bottom line, and making pieces that will move in the gallery. It's the reality of the business, and sometimes it can feel restricting as far as for a young artist. You don't get to make what you want to make. And I remember when I started to switch that frame of thought and made things that I that I wanted to make. Oh, and the other one along that line was a little robin rattle. I think there's pictures on my artist page on Facebook. A little rattle that looks like a red-breasted robin. And it was just because I wanted to make it. I don't think anybody who is born an artist gets into the business part of it because of them, or they don't become artists because they want the money. They become artists because that's just what they are, and there's no other way to be. The business aspect of it allows you to make a living and pay your bills and all that. Yeah, if I didn't have to make a living, I probably wouldn't sell another piece ever again. It's a good question. I'll have to think on that some more. There's probably others.
I love how you say that, in the beginning, you're talking about how you're just, people are born an artist and there is no other way to be. And also when you're talking about, moving things, making things that are going to sell in a gallery, rather than what's on your heart. And it kind of reminded me of social media. Maybe you have like two photos of artwork and you're thinking that, well, this one I think the audience is going to like more, but this one I'm really drawn to. And then you're like, well, which one do I, want to do? The one that makes me happy or the one that I think that others will want to see? So it kind of just tied that into me thinking about it from that way too. And we have a question here from Crystal Christofferson, and she has a few questions for you.
Okay.
Is what's your favorite traditional native food? And then the second one is what's your favorite art form to create, like drums, rattles, boxes, etc.
Let's see, my favorite food, native food. It's a tie. I really am a fan of deer meat. So deer meat cooked pretty much any way is right up there tied with what we call Lulansk, which all of us have, but it's salmon, eggs, and black seaweed over rice with Oligan grease. And that'll make me happy any day of the week. Yeah. What's my favorite thing to make? Well, formline is really my passion. So thankfully, most pieces I get to paint one way or another, or design and carve, which is fantastic. I love carving totem poles. And part of that, I think, and maybe the reason it's up there on top, is they don't come around all the time. I've made about 25 in my career. And, in the scheme of things, I've made dozens of masks and lots of other stuff. But I think maybe my favorite thing to do is carve totem poles. And that's sort of the family business too. So that's part of that, I think.
Oh, very cool. We have a question from Lily Lelena Hope, and she's wondering, do you ever make art pieces based on dreams you've had?
I can't think of one that came from a dream. I do recall having, I hesitate to use the word vision, but it just came to me. I remember where I was when it happened. So it was like a waking dream. I remember standing up from a couch to go walk to the sink, and this flash hit me, and I saw this talking stick that illustrated the story of Raven releasing the sun from the box of daylight. And it was, I had to rush over to a piece of paper and sketch it out. And this is somewhere on my social media too, if you can find it, but the box is at the bottom of the talking stick. And then halfway up, the smoke trail caused by, it's Raven flying out is almost like a space shuttle launching, and halfway up the stick is the lid of the box having been blown up off of the box, and up at the top is Raven with his arms stretched up over his head holding the sun in his hands, and he's flying up to put the sun in the sky. It just, I don't know if it probably came from all my Superman comic books, but yeah, every once in a while something just appears in my head, fully formed, and it's up to me to pull it out. Other times I have to work through it. I know kind of what I need to make or what I've been asked to make, and then I have to wait for that moment of inspiration, and those do come eventually. Sometimes it's real quick, other times you got to work at it, but eventually you just, like, if I'm sketching an idea, eventually just the way the pencil moves on the paper, I know I'm on to whatever it is that I'm going to make. Good question.
Yeah, that is so cool. You hear about like musicians and then them having, like, they hear the music, they're dreaming, and then they have to run off and write it right quick. And it's so cool that it works for you too with your art. But yeah, sometimes it's just so crystal clear and it's there. I was wondering, it sort of ties in with another question. Well, the house front you did with your dad, was that to collaborate with him, and was it a shared vision, or how did that come about to be? And then Allison Bremner is wondering, on that note, now that you've done that, what's next on your bucket list?
Well, on my bucket list, I'm hoping eventually get to carve a few really large totem poles. But in regards to the house front, there's a couple more house fronts kicking around in my head that I hope someday to get the opportunity to tackle. Because of that book I mentioned earlier, Transforming Images, some house fronts in there that really influenced my work and my perspective on formline. So when the opportunity came up to do a house front, Tsimshians were kind of known for those. And it was an opportunity to add to that heritage, to add to that legacy. And Dad and I both took it very seriously. I think it's something we both had wanted to do. And my dad, who is my biggest fan and likes working with me, and I like working with him, tries to include me as much as possible in what he's doing. So when it came about, he said, "Hey, you want to do a house front with me?" So of course I do. Most house fronts are just painted. So when we found out that it was going to be carved too, that added a little bit of anxiety, just because we knew how much work it was going to be. It was a shared vision in that we wanted to create a house front that looked like it belonged with all those other old Tsimshian house fronts. You know, that in 500 years, art historians, if we're all still around by then, art historians would look at it and say, you know, that obviously Tsimshian belongs with all those other Tsimshian house fronts. But when it came to designing it, I'm very grateful to my dad. He just kind of let me have at it. And the side panels, the eagle and wolf and the killer whale and raven side panels are mine as far as who did them. The center panel was a collaboration with Dad and I, and it was great. It took about 6 months, and it's one of my proudest one of the pieces I'm most proud of. It really, you know, carving totem poles and then making a house front, you know, it's every once in a while you have to pinch yourself that you get to create monumental art. It's a fantastic thing, and I'd like to do a couple more.
Yeah, every time I walk into the building at work, I'm just blown away with that. I can't believe it only took you 6 months. That's crazy.
Working about 6 days a week.
Okay.
Yeah, we work pretty darn hard.
How many hours a day would you say you spent on it roughly?
We treated it mostly like a job. I'd say on average 7 hours a day, maybe.
Wow.
Sometimes 7 days a week. My dad is a workhorse. Yeah, he just go still now. Yeah.
Very cool. We have a question here from Susie Yago Janas, and she's wondering if you use software to draw, and what software do you use?
I don't use it to draw. I'm old school that way. I've got dozens of drawing pads laying around the house and pencil. But when I do go to digitize my work, I use Adobe Illustrator. So I'll scan in a picture of the drawing, the loose sketch. Sometimes it's a refined sketch or a loose sketch, and then I'll refine it or finish it on Illustrator. It's ironic that I left art school because so much had become digital, but the world has just changed so much since the turn of the century that the main reason for me doing it is that it's become such a normal thing. People need digital images to produce, whether it's t-shirts or advertising or whatever. But up until I started doing it, you know, there's not a lot of folks who also know formline. And there were many occasions where I'd send a design out, and I'm sure a well-meaning digital artist sent back what they thought was my drawing, and it just wasn't replicated the way I would want the design done, the way it's supposed to be done. And then I had a buddy of mine, one of my best friends, Tyson Brown, who is just a phenomenal formline artist. I met while working for Robert. He digitized my work for a while, but and I don't blame him. After a while, said, you know, Davey, I want to do my own work. I don't want to keep digitizing everybody else's. So it forced me to learn how to do that. And I've come to enjoy the freedom to be able to make those digital pieces the way I need them to be. And then there's the extreme versatility of what you can do with those files. So that's my very long answer to that simple question.
So you talk about how you know, like there's I'm just curious how the different parts of your culture, like the language and the music, and then being home, how they all influence your artwork. And then on top of that, Lindsay Brolini is wondering how you got involved with the Sealaska language revitalization.
Oh, well, these are two very long answers. I'm going to try to make them short. Well, our culture, both of those questions tie in together. Our language is everything, and it informs our culture. It informs our identity, whether we realize it or not. Even though so many of us have been separated from our languages for a long time now. And that's not our fault. It's not our grandparents' fault. But the language is one piece of the culture that can't be removed. As a matter of fact, it's kind of the linchpin that if we lose the language, so much of the rest of our culture goes with it. Language gives you a different way to look at the world. Every language does that, no matter what language it is. It informs how you see the world. So yeah, Sealaska has had an influence on my approach. I don't know if I can explain just how, but I feel it when I work. And as far as how I got into it, my father was raised by his grandparents, and he spoke Sealaska as a little boy. Was probably fluent in it as a toddler and young elementary school years. Matter of fact, he didn't have to take a foreign language in college because of it. So I've been around it my whole life. My great grandfather, who was born in 1894, was around till I was 10. So I've heard it. I could make the sounds. I've taught culture camps since I was a teenager. Done my own independent study. Worked with fluent speakers off and on. But then when the last fluent EAC speaker passed in 2009, that kind of gave us all a jolt. And it started a process that eventually led to me moving home to do this. And I've been working now with our fluent speaker, Mrs. Sarah Booth, for the last, it's going on 5 years. And what really, the final, the thing that really got me to do it, to finally make that commitment, was I was actually standing in a gallery. And I was looking at my piece on the wall, and next to it on the wall was a little label. All the pieces have labels to say who made it and that and the price. And it said David Robert Boxley, Tsimshian. And it was a moment of clarity. And I thought to myself, what good does this do? What good am I doing selling this work here? If that word Tsimshian, if soon people aren't going to even know what that means, that there won't be anyone left that speaks that language, that explains where that word comes from and all the history that's tied to it. So much will be lost if the language is lost too. And because I had a background in it, and that I'd already started learning that, and the freedom of being a self-employed artist with no children, that I could just go. I could just go and do this. And I hope I answered those questions. That's about as quick as I could answer those questions. Those are really deep issues, and those are really important. Matter of fact, we're going to be doing this again next Friday, and I'd like to speak more about the language in that then.
I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that too. Thanks for touching on it. First of all, I'm jealous. You got to be raised with your great grandfather. That is so cool that you got to grow up with that language firsthand. And thank you for your work in keeping the language alive and moving back home. I think that's really important and sharing your knowledge here with us. We have another question from Lilena Hope, and she's asking, do you and your siblings collaborate on work? And or do you bounce creative ideas off each other?
My brother, Zach, is a bentwood box maker, paddle carver, and skin drum maker. He's very good at it. And any of those pieces you see of mine, whether it's a bentwood box, box drum, paddle, drum, 99% of the time he made those things for me. I've made 3 bentwood boxes in my life. I've stretched maybe 5 drums, and I think I've made 2 paddles. And a lot of Northwest Coast artists do this, and I do think that was also done in the old days. Zach is a different kind of artist than I am. His approach to it is very different. So there's not as much talk about what it's going to be. It's more like, hey, make me this thing. This is what I'm going to put on it. And he's like, oh, that's cool. Okay. It's amazing how different siblings can be, personalities and all of that. And as similar as my brother and I are, our personalities are also quite different.
That is so awesome to have artists all in the family. How special is that? Lindsay Brolini is asking, do you have any advice that you can share for up and coming artists?
Well, number one, do it because you love it. I think that's probably the most important advice I can give. Don't do it because you think there's a career in it. Don't do it just because you're Tlingit, Haida, or Tsimshian. That's not a reason to become an artist. You got to do it because it comes from your soul. And I don't mean that because if it isn't there that you're not capable. I just mean being an artist isn't an easy life. Sometimes it's feast or famine. Sometimes your work doesn't sell. And it's that passion and doing it because you'd be doing it whether there was money or not. That's really important. I think that's crucial. And I've seen some artists who end up doing it for the paycheck and they're not nearly as happy. Another bit of advice that I got from Chris Hopkins when I was apprenticing with him that I think is some of the best advice I ever received in my life was that you have to be a lifetime student. You can never think, okay, I know everything there is to know about this, or that I've licked it and there's nobody can tell me anything. I can't learn anything new. The minute you do that, you stop growing, your work stops growing, and that extends to your life as well. You know, the minute you close yourself off, nothing changes. Nothing's going to get better. New opportunities aren't going to come because you've closed yourself off. You have to be a lifetime student. A couple of years ago, I took a whistle making class from John Hudson. He's another great Tsimshian artist here in Metlakatla. That was phenomenal. And I know how to make whistles now because of it. And the other, especially during hard economic times like this, is you got to keep working, even when things aren't selling. And that goes back to, if you enjoy it, that makes it a lot easier. Eventually a piece will sell. And if you keep working, if you keep producing, there's a better chance that something's going to sell. And the last bit of advice, particularly for the style of art that is traditional for our peoples, is to study the old pieces. Don't think that you can be slick and make something brand new that's better than the old stuff if you've never studied the old stuff. You have to look at the old pieces to understand how and why things are put together the way they are. Particularly with formline. Formline is a system that works a certain way. And if you take the time to learn the system, the early feelings of restriction melt away, and eventually you can do anything with it. But those who know the art will always be able to pick out what's following the guidelines of the art and what isn't. It's not to say that the ones that aren't following it are bad. They're just not following the system. And the system is beautiful and it works for a reason. And it's probably my favorite thing on the planet is really excellent formline. So there we go.
I was wondering, how long do you think it took you before you really got, you felt like you had, you understood the system? How long did you study it before you're able to translate what you saw in your head and make sure it was following the rules?
All told, if you condensed it, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years. I mean, in reality, I mean, I started really focusing on formline when I was about 10 years old. And I'd say I was 20, 28 or 29 before that happened. But if I'm just thinking about intense study, yeah, it was 6 or 7 years probably before I felt like I could produce a design that felt like the way you see the old pieces. Yeah, and I made that distinct mission for myself because if I thought, because the art was cut off, you know, the Indian Act in Canada, colonialism stopped the potlatch. So that immediately stopped artists from creating pieces for potlatches because that's when those amazing things were brought up. So the old masters didn't pass on what they knew. And there was a period of time where people just did their best to remember what was and tried to hang on, and these intermediate styles were produced. So I thought, well, if I can focus on learning the old way, whatever comes next, whatever natural changes happen after that will be the natural progression of the art, because every art changes. But again, and it goes back to my advice to everybody, if you change it without understanding how it's built, you know, it's like building a building without a foundation. It's gonna crumble. And learning that foundation is everything.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question from Dre Azak, and he's wondering, what's your favorite ancestral story to share with others? And in what forms of art have, I think he's wondering, have you translated the story into your art?
I think matter of fact, it's a piece that I'm hoping to. I was just actually talking to the SHI store about sending a painting up that I've done. There's a story that was documented in by William Bainan, who's a Tsimshian who wrote down a lot of our old our old stories, where I think the title is How We Know Tsimshian Still Lives. And Tsimshian is our word for raven. And it takes place after contact. This young man, the Reader's Digest version here, this young man is out hunting and he gets lost, and he is in an area he's never seen before, and he goes down into this valley and finds a house kind of all by itself along a little creek or river. And this long gray-haired man is out front, and he starts talking to him. He invites him in to eat, and he starts telling stories of his life to this young man. And as he's telling these stories, the young man realizes that the stories the guy is telling are Raven's stories, but he's telling them as if he's Raven, and he realizes that's who it is. And after spending a lot of time listening to those stories, he realizes, oh, I got to get out of here. I got to get home. And as he's leaving, Raven says, well, if you just walk straight right down this way, the path will lead you out of the valley. And as he got to the end of the path where he started to realize where he was, he turned around and the mountains behind him were closing back up. Raven had made a way out of the valley for him, and then the mountains closed back up behind him. And that's amazing. I love that story. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. And it's so cool because I feel like I haven't heard that many stories post-contact.
Yeah.
And it's really a powerful one. Thank you for sharing that with us. That kind of ties into another question. I just have two more for you. This one is from Phil Valencourt, and he's wondering how you feel about the direction Formline is going with prints, digital tattoos, etc.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to do what my dad would do in this situation and just be honest. I think that the mediums that we have access to are fantastic. And I think utilizing different colors and, glass and t-shirts and everything else that we have access to these days is good. I think a culture and an art need to adapt with the times. I think that's reality. I think we can't be stuck in the 1800s culturally. We have to factor in what's gone on in our world into how we function. Having said all that, I have a pretty deep concern about Formline and the relatively few number of people who have really taken it back to what it was and moved it forward from there. That's not happening enough. There isn't enough time spent on the foundational principles. There's a lot of folks making really good careers who I wish would spend a little more time studying, because their work would be all that much better. And that's not to say there's nothing I've ever made that's as good as the old pieces. I don't mean to sound like I'm the judge of all that, but I really hope that people will take the time to learn those foundational principles, because again, once you've internalized those, once they've become second nature, it really becomes endless what you can do. And the reason for the restrictive nature of the art is tied directly into our culture. And art is it's emblematic of the culture it comes from. And we come from a fairly strict culture. Potlatching has to go a certain way. There's, you don't just get to walk in the feast hall and say whatever you want and do whatever you want. You got to follow protocol. And Formline is that same way. But like any art form, and even potlatching is an art form, once you really know it, man, you can do anything you want with it. It's so I have hope, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to say I really hope people go back to those old pieces. You can make a name for yourself and a style for yourself after you figure out how it's supposed to work. That's what I think.
Yeah, just talking about that, it kind of reminded me of Picasso. He started highly realistic.
That's right.
Just, copying the masters. But then through that, he was able to develop his own style. And
And if you look at his early stuff, he was phenomenal at portraits and all of that. It was amazing. And that allowed for that growth. And it's the same thing with Robert Davidson for the Haida. And he would also tell you to go look at the old master's work in order to learn. But he did that same thing. You know, he got really good at that, and then he decided to go somewhere else with his work. But his work is stronger because of that foundation.
for your advice, when you say studying from the masters, would you just replicate what they did and draw it and maybe not share it, but just so you understand the language of it? Or how would you go about studying?
Yeah, you get sketchbooks, trace, replicate. There have been plenty of occasions where lots of artists will replicate a piece and put it out, but just make sure that you're honest that you replicated it. You know, you don't, and you don't do that with contemporary pieces. You don't replicate another living artist, but you can replicate the old stuff. But you just say, this is a replica of this piece from this time. You don't take credit for work that isn't solely yours. You know, that's a good ethical way to be. But yeah, there's only one way, is to study those old pieces. And that's the closest we can get to the old masters helping us. It's basically, you know, if you even blow up an image, lay tracing paper over it and trace over the image, it's almost like the old masters getting to put their hand on yours and move your pencil around those shapes. You know, that's it's the only way to do it.
Oh, you're making me tear up. That's so sweet. I just took a formline class with Wayne Price this semester, and back when we could be in classrooms together, I could just feel like all the ancestors. I never felt so connected with them. Like I really felt their presence there, and it was a really cool feeling. And then I'm a Kwan, so I'm on the land that my ancestors were, and it was really strong and special. And I love that you're talking about having their hand over your hand. That is, yeah, I feel that too. I'm gonna have to start learning from the old masters too. That's gonna be a fun summer project. We have the last question is a short one, and it's from Susie Yaga Janos, and she's wondering, what social media platforms are you on? Do you show your art on the accounts often?
I have David Robert Boxley, Tsimshian artist, on Facebook. And I believe it's at David Robert Boxley. I don't know for sure. On Instagram. And I'm on Twitter, although I don't tweet all that much. It's usually just reposts from Instagram. Instagram tends to be the most up-to-date as far as things I'm working on, and then things will go to Facebook often when I have more professional shots to share. Again, I'm not producing nearly as much as I used to because of the language work I'm doing, but I keep kicking pieces out. So Instagram and Facebook are my main social media accounts. And before we end up, I want to thank you for this, for helping me get through this today. And all you and your coworkers at Sealaska Heritage Institute, I really appreciate what you guys are doing for our cultures, like at Haida Tsimshian cultures. SHI has been a good partner to me, and I appreciate you guys working to try to keep your programs going through this pandemic and keep offering what you can in whatever way you can. So thanks to SHI and to all of you, whoever watched tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you for sharing, and for all the information you shared tonight. It was really special, and it definitely brightened my day, and I hope it brought a little joy to everyone else too. And I'm really looking forward to going live with you again next Friday. And David will be talking more about the language revitalization then. So keep your eyes peeled for more info, and we hope to see you there then. Everyone have a great weekend. Take care, David.
Sam's Wowsome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh Chish.